This interview is a part of the Oklahoma Historical Society's Oral History Program, Living Legends Collection. This interview was originally conducted on April the 24th, 1970, on the occasion of the National Cowboy Hall of Fame and Western Heritage Awards in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. The interview was conducted by Mr. Pendleton Woods. The interviewee is Mr. Benjamin Capps. That's Capps. Mr. Capps is an author. This interview was re-recorded on September the 9th, 1985, for inclusion in the permanent collections of the Oral History Program by Judith Michener.
On April 24th, 1970, on the occasion of the Western Heritage Awards 10th annual ceremony of the National Cowboy Hall of Fame and Western Heritage Center. We will start off by interviewing some of the winners of the 10th annual Western Heritage Awards, and we'll continue with some of the actual proceedings at the ceremony. One, two, three, four. This is Penn Woods interviewing for the Oklahoma Living Legends Library. I'm visiting this afternoon with Mr. Benjamin Capps on the day of the Western Heritage Awards dinner for 1970, which will be held at the Cowboy Hall of Fame in just a few hours. Mr. Capps has just recently arrived, and we would like to visit with you. Mr. Capps, would you tell us about where you are from, a little bit of your personal background?
I was born and reared in Texas, and I spent a good bit of time in Oklahoma and Colorado. And, of course, I've always been interested in Western lore and Western history. And it's a great thing to be here in this great awards presentation tonight.
Now, you are here as the winner of what award?
The most outstanding novel for the year.
Would you tell us about your novel, the title, and a little bit about it?
The title is The White Man's Road, and it's set in southeastern Oklahoma. The main character is a young Comanche Indian who's faced with the problems, well, that such Indians had about 1890 as they tried to become integrated into the American life.
Could you tell us a little about the research that you may have done in the development of this book?
Well, of course, I've been reading in libraries for a long time, but I was born and reared in the South Plains, so that I know something about the kind of environment that made the Comanche Indian, you see, and then in the immediate research on this novel, of course, I chased around in the old Comanche Kiowa Reservation in the Wichita Mountains and other areas in southwestern Oklahoma, and did a lot of specific research to find out what kind of life they led in the 1890s and what kind of problems they faced.
Could you describe a little of the life that they lived in the 1890s, not necessarily just as reflected in your novel, but as a result of your own research?
Well, it's a very interesting time in 1890 because the great fighting warriors were still alive, and they were still living legends, of course, and at the same time, there were young men just becoming men who had never had a chance to kill a buffalo, you see, because the buffalo disappeared in the southern plains in the 70s. So you had Indians living in buffalo hide teepees that were wearing out. Most of them lived in canvas teepees, and very few of them lived in houses, plank houses, log houses, and so it was a very dynamic time. There were many conflicts on account of the change that they were undergoing at that time. I find it really one of the most interesting times among the Indians, and of course it was a sad time in many ways, but it was a young Indian had this sort of these heroes out of the past before him, and at the same time there was no possibility of his living that kind of life, and that's really the problem that this young Comanche faced that I wrote about.
Could you talk a little about some of the conflicts of this period?
Well, they were of all kinds. Take marriage, for example. Marriage meant one thing to these Plains Indians, and of course that was not going to be recognized as they began to live just exactly as the white man did. So that's one area.
Could you describe what it meant to the Plains Indians?
Well, there were, of course, the Kiowas and Comanches had plural wives. They had several wives, for example, and wasn't going to be acceptable in later on. And also, their marriage was right. Their marriages were right according to their old customs, but they were not legal according to the practices today. So, and there was always the question of whether the young man is going to bring 5 horses and pay for the young lady, or whether he's just going to get her permission and go to a preacher, you see, and be married there. So these are some of the kind of problems. I think it was the greatest crisis was a kind of a crisis of manhood. What does one of these young Indians do that makes him a man, you see? And the white man's customs really are alien. They even though it's not a question of whether they're better or worse, they were alien to him at the time, and yet that was the only road in the long run that was going to be possible.
Could you tell about your character in the book and some of the problems that he personally faced in your novel?
Well, the novel has been described as a magnificent horse raid. One thing that he does in trying to reach for the the kind of prestige that a man gained 30 years before, he goes in with some of his young friends, and they make a big raid on some cavalry horses and succeed in keeping them for several days. And of course, it was hopeless. There was no possibility that they could get the horses and keep them, but it was a kind of a symbolic act that they committed, I don't know, in the attempt to capture the kind of manhood that their ancestors had captured.
Have you done other writing in the area of the Comanche?
Yes, I have another book, Woman of the People, which is a book about a captive white child who grew up with the Comanches.
Could you tell us about any of your other writing?
Well, I have a novel, Trail to Ogallala, I guess is the best known. It's about a cattle drive, and was published in 1964.
What area was it covering?
Well, it began down west of San Antonio and came up the old Western Cattle Trail and entered Oklahoma over what they call Dome's Crossing, and came up through western Oklahoma and across Kansas to Ogallala, Nebraska. And so it covered a good bit of western terrain, and I tried to write an authentic account of what a cattle drive was really like.
What type of research did you do on that one?
Well, again, it's always a question. All of my books have been set in that part of the country that I know already, you see, and it's a question of just a great deal of library research. When a person gets digging into it, there's an awful lot of nonfiction material available. On cattle driving, there's a vast volume, or perhaps 2 volumes, called the Old Trail Drivers of Texas, and it's all first-hand stuff that actual trail drivers wrote when they were old. So there's a great deal of material a fiction writer can use if you dig it out.
Have you ever lived in Oklahoma?
Yes, I taught at Tahlequah in Northeastern State College 2 years. I taught English and journalism.
What years? What years were you teaching?
Well, let's see. This would be 49, 50, and 50, 51. My wife's born out here in western Oklahoma.
What town?
Well, I doubt you've ever heard of it. It was Burns Flat. It's over toward Elk City. It's near Cardell. I don't know the area too well.
Have you been to the Cowboy Hall of Fame before?
No, I haven't.
Well,
I've always intended to, though. It's really a wonderful work, I think. You know.
Well, it certainly is nice to talk with you, Mr. Capps, and we appreciate very much your being here. I think you'll have a fine experience ahead tonight.
I know I will. I know I will. Thank you, Mr. Wood.
This is